What happens when an alien diplomat ignores a human's warning and gets stung by something that rewrites her mind from the inside out? And why would a battle-scarred captain risk everything, including his own consciousness, to save someone who thinks his entire species are barbarians? This is the story of a crash landing that changed two worlds, a neural link that shouldn't be possible in the moment humanity proved that some things are worth dying for. But first, she had to learn to listen. She dismissed the human's caution. Now she might not survive the night. Captain Elias Ward stared at the transport manifest on his datapad, the words blurring together like a migraine waiting to happen. VIP transport, unraveling, diplomatic envoy, the kind of assignment that could make or break a career depending on how badly things went sideways. Another babysitting gig. Darthalon Ross dropped into the co-pilot seat, his weathered hands already reaching for the pre-flight checklist. 20 years of patching up soldiers had left Ross with the kind of steady calm that only came from seeing too much blood and not enough miracles. Worse, Elias flicked the manifest toward his old friend. Kalari diplomat's daughter. High-priority transport to the Draveris Peace Summit. Ross whistled low. The Ice Princess herself. Heard she's got a tongue that could cut through titanium plating. The airlock hissed open before Elias could respond. Ari Vela stepped aboard like she owned the universe, and maybe she did. 6 feet of pale blue elegance with silver markings that traced intricate patterns along her temples and down her neck. Her eyes held the kind of cold intelligence that made humans feel like lab specimens under a microscope. Captain Ward, I presume. Her voice carried the crisp authority of someone who'd never been told no and didn't plan on starting today. I trust this vessel meets minimum safety standards for diplomatic transport. Elias bit back his first 3 responses. Welcome aboard the Meridian, Miss Vela. Dr. Ross will handle any medical concerns during our journey. She glanced at Ross with the kind of look reserved for interesting, but ultimately disposable curiosities. How reassuring. I wasn't aware humans had progressed beyond battlefield surgery. Ross grinned, completely unfazed. Ma'am, I've kept more soldiers breathing than you've probably met, but I appreciate the vote of confidence. The Kalari woman settled into her assigned seat with fluid grace, her fingers dancing across a personal datapad. Captain, I assume you're familiar with Draveris atmospheric conditions. The electromagnetic interference can be challenging for human technology. I've made the run before. Elias began the launch sequence, his hands moving through the familiar rhythm of switches and confirmations. Standard approach vector, controlled descent. Nothing we can't handle. Ori looked up from her pad, those ice blue eyes fixing on him with uncomfortable intensity. Standard approaches killed 3 transport crews last month. Perhaps we should discuss alternative routes. Miss Vela, the storm patterns shift without warning. Magnetic fields that can fry navigation systems in seconds. Your standard approach assumes a predictability that simply doesn't exist on Draveris. Elias felt his jaw tighten. 23 successful runs to the desert world, and this diplomat's daughter wanted to lecture him on flight safety. I appreciate your concern, but do you? She leaned forward, her voice dropping to that dangerous quiet that preceded either wisdom or warfare. Because from where I'm sitting, Captain, you look like every other human pilot I've met. Confident right up until the moment that reality proves you wrong. The silence stretched between them like a held breath. Ross cleared his throat diplomatically. Perhaps we could review the weather patterns together. Fresh eyes never hurt anyone. Ori's gaze shifted to the doctor, something almost like approval flickering across her features. At least one of you understands the value of caution. Elias engaged the autopilot with more force than necessary. The Meridian lifted smoothly from the station's stars, wheeling past the viewports as they angled toward Draveris. Miss Vela, in my experience, the biggest danger in space isn't electromagnetic storms or navigation failures. It's overthinking yourself into paralysis when you should be flying. How human of you. She returned to her datapad, but her words carried the kind of frost that could crack hull plating. I suppose we'll discover which philosophy proves correct. Ross caught Elias's eye and shrugged the kind of gesture that said, you started this dance, partner. The doctor had seen enough diplomatic missions to know when personalities were about to collide like asteroids in a gravity well. 6 hours to Draveris. 6 hours locked in a metal tube with a woman who thought humans were barely evolved barbarians, and a growing certainty that this mission would end with someone wanting to throw someone else out an airlock. Elias watched the stars and tried not to think about how many ways this could go wrong. He should have listened to that instinct. Outside the viewports, space stretched endlessly in all directions. Beautiful, silent, and completely indifferent to the small human dramas playing out in the ships that dared to cross it. The Meridian flew on carrying its cargo of good intentions and barely contained hostility toward a world where electromagnetic storms could kill without warning. And in her seat, Ori Vela studied her weather data with the intensity of someone who'd learned that the universe had teeth and wasn't afraid to use them. The first warning came as a whisper, a barely perceptible flutter in the navigation display that made Elias frown at his instruments. Electromagnetic interference, just like Ori had predicted, the kind that started small and grew teeth fast. "Captain?" Ross's voice carried the edge of someone who'd seen too many emergencies unfold in slow motion. Sensor arrays showing some unusual readings. Elias's hands moved across the controls, trying to compensate for the growing static in their systems. Define unusual. Magnetic field fluctuations that shouldn't exist. Whatever's building down there, it's big. Ross pointed to the atmospheric scanner where wave patterns dance like a seizure in digital form. "And it's moving fast." Ori looked up from her datapad, those ice blue eyes sharp with something that might have been vindication. "How's that standard approach working for you, Captain?" Before Elias could respond, the Meridian shuddered. Not the gentle vibration of atmospheric entry. This was the bone-deep rattle of a ship fighting forces it wasn't designed to handle. Emergency lights flickered to life, bathing the cabin in angry red. "All hands secure for emergency descent." Elias's training kicked in muscle memory, overriding the growing certainty that they were about to become another cautionary tale. "So, Ross, get the med bay prepped. Miss Vela, strap in and hold on." The electromagnetic storm hit them like a fist made of lightning and fury. Every system on the ship screamed warnings as magnetic fields strong enough to liquefy metal tore through their electronics. The artificial gravity stuttered, sending loose objects floating in lazy, impossible arcs. "Navigation's down," Ross called out, his fingers flying across backup systems that sparked and died as fast as he could activate them. "Primary engines are offline." Ori's knuckles were white against her restraints, but her voice remained steady. "Emergency beacon. Fried." Elias fought the controls, trying to guide their falling coffin towards something that looked like survivable terrain. Through the viewports, Draveris rushed up to meet them, endless stretches of rust-colored badlands, broken by jagged rock formations that could split a ship like an eggshell. The crash came in stages. First, the grinding impact as the Meridian's belly kissed the desert at entirely the wrong angle. Then the screaming bounce that sent them tumbling across hardpan like a skipped stone. Finally, the terminal collision with a boulder field that brought everything to a ringing, smoking halt. Silence. The kind that meant either everyone was dead or everyone was too shocked to confirm they were alive. Elias tasted blood and inventory checked his body parts. Everything seemed to be where he'd left it, though his left shoulder felt like someone had introduced it to a plasma torch. "Sound off." "Conscious and irritated?" Ross groaned from somewhere behind a cascade of fallen medical supplies. "But breathing, which beats the alternative." Ori's voice came sharp and clear. "Functional, ship status." Elias ran diagnostics on systems that mostly weren't there anymore. "Life support's stable for now. Hull integrity's holding, but we're not flying anywhere soon. Maybe not ever." He turned to look at his passengers. Ross was already checking for injuries with the methodical efficiency of a battlefield medic. Ori sat rigid in her restraints, those pale markings along her temples glowing faintly with what might have been stress or concentration. "Emergency protocols suggest we remain aboard until rescue arrives," she said, but her eyes were fixed on the nearest viewport and the alien landscape beyond. Elias followed her gaze. Draveris stretched to the horizon in waves of red sand and black stone, beautiful in the way that deadly things often were. "Miss Vela, under no circumstances should you..." She was already unstrapping herself. "The communication array might have survived the impact. If I can reach the external access panel..." "Negative." Elias's voice carried the flat authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed in crisis situations. This planet's atmosphere contains trace elements that can react badly with Kalari physiology. You stay put until we can fabricate proper biosuits. Ori paused, her hand hovering over the airlock controls. For a moment, something vulnerable flickered across her features. Surprise, maybe that someone was trying to protect her rather than use her. Then her usual mask of cool competence slid back into place. Captain, I appreciate your concern, but I'm quite capable of assessing my own risk tolerance. Your risk tolerance doesn't extend to neural system failure from atmospheric poisoning. She actually smiled at that, a sharp, predatory expression that suggested she knew something he didn't. Humans, always so certain about things they've never actually experienced. The airlock cycled open before Elias could stop her. Dravaris air rushed into the ship carrying scents of copper and ozone that made his skin crawl. Ori stepped onto the planet's surface with the fluid grace of someone born to walk between worlds, her pale blue skin unmarked by any obvious reaction to the alien atmosphere. See, she called back, spreading her arms wide. Sometimes the universe is more accommodating than you. She never finished the sentence. The attack came from below faster than thought and silent as death. Something erupted from the sand behind her, a blur of segmented chitin and needle-sharp appendages that struck with surgical precision. Ori spun her eyes wide with shock, one hand pressed to her neck where a thin line of silver blood welled from a puncture wound no bigger than a pin. "Burrow stinger!" Ross shouted, already grabbing a medical kit. "Get her inside now!" Elias didn't remember moving. One moment he was at the airlock, the next, he was on Dravaris soil, hauling Ori back toward the ship as something chittered angrily in the sand behind them. Her weight sagged against him, and he could feel tremors starting to run through her limbs. "Stupid," he muttered, half carrying her up the ramp. Incredibly, brilliantly stupid. "Captain?" Her voice was already starting to slur, the Kalari equivalent of shock setting in fast. "I may have miscalculated." Ross met them at the airlock, scanner in hand, in worry written across his weathered features. "Get her to the medbay, now." They laid her on the examination table as Ross ran diagnostics with the efficiency of someone who'd learned that speed was often the difference between a patient and a corpse. The readings that came back made him curse in 3 languages. "Neural contamination," he said grimly. The stinger introduced some kind of parasitic organism directly into her nervous system. It's designed specifically for Kalari neural pathways like a lock and key. Elias felt something cold settle in his stomach. Treatment options. Working on it. Ross's hands flew across medical databases, searching for anything that might help. "But Captain, this isn't just venom. It's a targeted bioweapon. Something evolved specifically to hunt Kalari." On the table, Ori's pale markings began to flicker irregularly like a dying communications array. Her eyes found Elias's, and for the first time since he'd met her, he saw genuine fear there. "I should have listened," she whispered. Outside, Dravaris wind howled across the Badlands, carrying the scent of things that hunted in the dark. And somewhere in the sand, other burrow stingers stirred, drawn by the scent of wounded prey. 2 hours after the attack, Ori began to fracture. It started small, a tremor in her left hand that spread up her arm like electricity seeking ground. Then her pale markings began to strobe in patterns that hurt to look at, neural pathways firing randomly as the parasitic organism rewrote her nervous system from the inside out. "Temperatures spiking again," Ross muttered, adjusting the thermal regulators around her bed. 103 and climbing. At this rate, her brain's going to cook itself. Elias watched helplessly as the woman who dominated their transport cabin with ice-cold intellect thrashed against restraints, her eyes wide and unfocused. "How long do we have?" "Hard to say. Kalari neural architecture is different from ours, more integrated, less compartmentalized. If this thing reaches her core consciousness..." Ross didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Ari's voice cut through their grim assessment, clear and sharp as crystal. "Father, I told you the peace negotiations were a mistake." Both men turned. She was staring at the ceiling, but her eyes tracked something that wasn't there, a conversation happening in a memory that felt more real than the metal walls around her. "Miss Vela?" Elias stepped closer, careful not to make sudden movements. "You're on the meridian. You're safe." She turned toward him, but her gaze looked through him to something else entirely. "The humans will betray us. They always do. And oh, Look at Kepler's station. They promised protection and delivered genocide. The words hit Elias like a physical blow. Kepler station, the incident that had poisoned human-Kalari relations for 3 decades, where a communications failure had led to a massacre neither side intended. No wonder she looked at him like a loaded weapon. "I'm not responsible for Kepler station," he said quietly. "Aren't you?" Her voice carried the weight of accumulated grief of a people who'd learned to expect the worst from first contact. "You wear their uniform. You carry their flag. You make their promises." Then she blinked, and for a moment her eyes focused on him with painful clarity. "Elias, where am I?" "Unraveling, you were stung by something that's affecting your nervous system. Dr. Ross is working on a treatment." She tried to sit up, fell back against the pillows with a gasp. "The summit! I have to get to the summit. If I'm not there, the negotiations will collapse and millions will die." "The summit can wait," Ross said firmly, checking her vitals on a scanner that was painting increasingly alarming pictures. "Right now, we need to focus on keeping you alive." Ori's laugh was bitter as winter wind. "Keeping me alive, doctor, you don't understand. I'm not just a diplomat's daughter. I'm the compromise candidate, the only person both factions trust enough to mediate. Without me, the peace process dies." The hallucinations took her again, and she was arguing with phantoms about treaty provisions and territorial disputes, her voice rising and falling in debates that existed only in her fragmenting mind. But between the delirium, Elias caught glimpses of the woman beneath the ice, brilliant, dedicated, carrying the weight of 2 species' future on shoulders that suddenly seemed too small for the burden. "Ross," Elias pulled his friend aside, keeping his voice low. "Give me options. Real ones." The doctor's face was grim as a battlefield surgeon's. "The organism is rewriting her neural pathways, essentially performing a hostile takeover of her nervous system. In humans, it would kill in hours. But Kalari neural integration means it's happening slower and more thoroughly. So we have time. Maybe 12 hours before irreversible damage sets in. After that," Ross shrugged helplessly, "even if we could extract the organism, her personality might not survive intact." Elias felt something cold settle in his chest. "Treatment options. There is one possibility." Ross called up a molecular diagram on his scanner. "Xantharine. It's a naturally occurring compound that interferes with parasitic neural integration. Could potentially reverse the process if administered soon enough." "Where do we find it?" Ross was quiet for a long moment. "Native Dravaran hives, deep underground structures about 40 kilometers north of here. The creatures that produce it are aggressive, and the regions have been classified as a no-return zone by every survey team that's attempted exploration." "How many teams?" 17. 0 survivors. The weight of that settled between them like a death sentence. 17 teams of trained explorers gone without a trace. And now he was supposed to walk into the same region with nothing but determination and increasingly desperate hope. "There has to be another way," Elias said, but even as the words left his mouth, he knew it was wishful thinking. "Captain," Ross's voice carried the quiet authority of someone who'd delivered too many terminal diagnoses. "I've run every simulation, checked every alternative compound in our databases. Xantharine is the only thing that can save her, and we don't have enough time to wait for rescue." On the medical bed, Ori cried out in a language Elias didn't recognize, her body convulsing as the organism pushed deeper into her neural core. Whatever she was experiencing, it was tearing her apart from the inside. "How much do we need?" Elias asked. "Maybe 50 grams of pure compound. The hives concentrated in specialized chambers, if you can reach the core structure and extract it." When, Ross corrected firmly, "because failure isn't an option here." Elias looked at this woman who'd dismissed his warnings, who'd walked into danger with the absolute confidence of someone who'd never encountered a problem her intellect couldn't solve. Now she was paying the price for that hubris, and the only way to save her was for him to make the same mistake, walking into danger with nothing but determination and a prayer. "What do I need to know about these hives?" Ross pulled up geological surveys on his scanner. "Underground networks, possibly sentient architecture that responds to intrusion. The creatures inside are described as aggressively territorial by the teams that lasted long enough to transmit data." Weaknesses. Unknown. Most teams went silent within hours of entry. The few emergency beacons we recovered suggested coordinated attacks like the hives themselves were hunting the intruders. Elias studied the topographical maps calculating distances and approach vectors. 40 kilometers across the hostile terrain down into alien structures that had killed 17 exploration teams to steal a compound from creatures that treated intrusion as a capital offense. I'll need environmental gear, climbing equipment, and whatever weapons survived the crash. Captain, Ross caught his arm. You don't have to do this. She made her choice when she ignored your warning. Elias looked at Ori, who was now speaking in rapid, fragmented Kalari, her words tumbling over each other like water through a broken dam. Even in delirium, her voice carried the weight of someone who dedicated her life to building bridges between species that had every reason to hate each other. No, he said quietly. She made a mistake. We all do. The question is whether we're willing to pay the price to fix it. He began gathering equipment, checking power cells, and calibrating instruments for a journey that would likely end with his name added to the list of people who'd underestimated Draveris and paid with their lives. But as he worked, Ori's voice drifted from the medical bay, lucid for a moment, speaking to phantoms about peace treaties and the chance to build something better than the violence that had defined human-Kalari relations. Maybe some mistakes were worth dying to fix. Outside, Draveris wind carried the scent of things that hunted in the deep places, and 40 kilometers north, ancient hives stirred with the patient hunger of creatures that had been waiting for prey to come to them. The Dravaran hive entrance yawned before Elias like a wound in the planet's flesh, a perfectly circular opening 30 meters across, carved into living rock with geometric precision that no natural force could have achieved. Heat rose from its depths, carrying a sense of copper and something organic that made his stomach clench. This is Captain Ward, he spoke into his comm unit, checking the signal one last time before descent. Beginning hive entry. If you don't hear from me in 6 hours, seal the ship and wait for rescue. Ross's voice crackled back through static. Her temperature's holding at 104. Neural cascade is accelerating, but she's still fighting it. Bring back that Xantharine, Captain. Elias adjusted his climbing harness and activated his helmet lights. The twin beams pierced maybe 20 meters into the darkness before being swallowed by shadows that seemed to move independently of his light source. He rappelled into the abyss, leaving the rust-colored sky of Draveris far above. The walls of the hive were smooth as glass, covered in patterns that hurt to look at, directly spiraling geometries that suggested intelligence without revealing purpose. As he descended, the temperature rose steadily, and his environmental suit's cooling systems kicked in with a low hum that echoed strangely in the confined space. 50 meters down, the shaft opened into a vast chamber carved from living stone. Elias's lights swept across surfaces that gleamed with organic secretions, revealing tunnels that branched away into darkness like arteries in some impossibly large organism. Bioluminescent patches pulsed along the walls in slow hypnotic rhythms, and everywhere movement. The first creature emerged from a tunnel to his left, something between a spider and a nightmare, with too many legs and eyes that reflected his lights like broken mirrors. It was the size of a small vehicle moving with liquid grace across surfaces that should have been impossible to navigate. Elias froze, hand moving slowly toward the plasma rifle on his hip. The creature regarded him for a long moment, head tilting with curious intelligence, then chittered something that might have been communication and retreated into its tunnel. A warning, he realized. Or maybe an announcement. He moved deeper into the hive, following bioscanners that detected increasingly concentrated levels of Xantharine somewhere in the complex heart. The tunnels were a maze designed by alien logic, branching and converging in patterns that defied mapping. His suit's navigation system gave up after the third level, displaying only error messages and confused question marks. The attack came without warning. Something struck him from above, a mass of chitin and fury that sent him tumbling across the chamber floor. He rolled, bringing his rifle to bear, but the creature was already melted back into shadows like it had never existed. More movement in his peripheral vision. The things were coordinating, using the tunnels to outflank him. Elias found himself thinking of the Sahri's war of alien forces that fought with inhuman patience and precision. Breathe, he told himself. Focus on the mission. But as another creature skittered across the ceiling above him, memory took hold with the grip of trauma that never fully healed. The trenches of Saharis 3 had smelled like this copper and organic decay with an undertone of something that might have been fear. Elias had been a lieutenant then, leading a squad of Marines against an enemy that fought like the landscape itself had turned hostile. Movement 2 o'clock, Sergeant Martinez had called out just before the Saharis constructs erupted from the ground like living nightmares. Things with too many limbs and weapons that grew from their bodies, coordinated by some hive intelligence, that treated individual lives as expendable resources. The battle had lasted 16 hours. When it ended, Elias was the only one left alive, in a crater filled with the bodies of soldiers who trusted him to bring them home. He'd carried that weight for 7 years. The faces of the dead, the sound Martinez made when the constructs finally reached him. The absolute certainty that he should have died with them instead of crawling away to live with the memory. A shriek echoed through the hive, snapping him back to the present. One of the creatures was advancing down the tunnel ahead, moving with deliberate purpose. Behind him, chittering sounds suggested others were closing off his retreat. Elias raised his rifle and fired. The plasma bolt lit up the chamber like a miniature sun, striking the creature's center mass and sending it tumbling back with an inhuman scream. The smell of burned chitin filled the air, and suddenly the hive was alive with angry voices. He ran. The tunnels blurred past as he followed his scanner deeper into the complex creatures pursuing him, with the relentless patience of things that had never known defeat on their home ground. Plasma bolts lit up the darkness as he fought running battles through chambers that echoed with alien architecture. But gradually the Zentharine readings grew stronger. Back on the Meridian, Ori's condition was deteriorating with mechanical precision. Dr. Ross monitored her vitals while she thrashed against restraints lost in memories that played out like broken holograms in her mind. "You're weak," her father's voice echoed in the sterile medical bay, though Ambassador Vela was light years away. "Emotional. These humans will exploit that weakness and destroy everything we've built." Ori, or the shadow of her lost in delirium bride, responded as she had when she was 12 years old and desperate for approval. "I can be stronger, Father. I can be what you need me to be. Can you?" The phantom Vela leaned forward, ice blue eyes identical to his daughter's. "Then prove it. Go to the summit. Make peace with a species that murdered our people at Kepler Station. Show me you can set aside your feelings and do what's necessary." Ross watched her neural activity spike to dangerous levels. Whatever conversation she was having with her memories, it was tearing her apart as effectively as the parasitic organism. "I tried," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I tried to be cold like you wanted, but they're not monsters, Father. The humans, they feel things. They hurt when people die. They carry guilt like stones in their hearts." Her markings flickered brighter, and for a moment her eyes opened, focusing on Ross with startling clarity. "Dr. Ross, is Elias alive? He's in the hive searching for Zentharine to save you. He shouldn't have gone." Tears traced silver paths down her pale cheeks. "I dismissed his warnings. I thought I knew better because that's what Father taught me. Never show weakness, never admit ignorance, never let anyone else be right." She closed her eyes again, slipping back into the labyrinth of her own mind. "But I was wrong about everything." 3 levels deeper in the hive, Elias found what he was looking for. The Zentharine chamber was a cathedral of living crystal walls lined with deposits that glowed like captured starlight. The compound formed in intricate geometric patterns growing from the stone in structures that followed some alien mathematics of beauty and function. But between him and the Zentharine stood the hive's guardian. It was larger than the others, ancient, in the way that apex predators could be ancient, perfectly adapted, unchanged, because change was unnecessary. 6 meters of armored death that moved with liquid grace despite its size. Eyes like black diamonds tracked his every movement. Elias raised his rifle knowing it would be useless against something that had survived every assault for decades. But as he prepared to fire, the creature did something unexpected. It spoke. Not in words, the sound was more like harmonics that resonated in his bones, patterns of meaning that bypassed language and went straight to understanding. And what it communicated was simple. Why Elias lowered his weapon slightly. There's someone dying, someone who made a mistake and is paying for it. I need the Zentharine to save her. The creature tilted its massive head, considering. Then it responded with another harmonic pattern Many have come for the sacred crystal. All sought to take, none sought to understand. I'm not here to understand, Elias said honestly. I'm here because a woman I barely know is dying, and this is the only way to save her. If that means I die down here, so be it. The guardian regarded him for a long moment. Then with movements that were almost gentle, it stepped aside. Elias approached the xantharine deposits with the reverence of someone who understood he was in the presence of something sacred. He filled his collection containers with enough pure compound to synthesize a treatment, careful not to take more than absolutely necessary. As he worked, the guardian spoke again. She is important to you. She's important to the peace between our species. Her life could save millions. No, the creature corrected with absolute certainty. She is important to you. Elias paused, considering the truth of that statement. When had Ari Vela stopped being a mission and become someone worth dying for? Maybe when she'd admitted she should have listened. Maybe when he'd seen the weight she carried trying to build bridges between species that had every reason for hatred. Or maybe it had been earlier in that first moment when her ice-cold composure had cracked to reveal the woman underneath. Yes, he said quietly, she is. The return journey to the surface passed in a blur of climbing and controlled urgency. The creatures he'd fought on the way down now watched from the shadows but didn't interfere, as if some message had passed through the hive that this human was under protection. When he finally emerged into Draveris's alien sky, the twin suns were setting, painting the Badlands in shades of fire and blood. He had enough xantharine to save Ori's life. The question was whether he'd make it back to the ship in time to use it. Elias collapsed through the Meridian's airlock like a man who'd outrun death and wasn't entirely sure he'd won the race. His environmental suit was scorched and torn, one arm hung at an awkward angle, and the xantharine samples clutched in his good hand represented the difference between salvation and watching someone die because he hadn't been fast enough. Ross, he called out, stumbling toward the medical bay. I've got it! Dr. Ross looked up from Ori's bedside, where monitors painted increasingly desperate pictures in red and amber warnings. Her neural activity was fragmenting in real-time consciousness, scattering like light through a broken prism. Thank God, Ross breathed, taking the sample containers with hands that shook only slightly. How much time do we have? Her core personality matrix is starting to collapse, Ross said, already moving toward the synthesis equipment. Maybe an hour before the damage becomes irreversible. But Captain, Mushan, he paused, studying the readings on his scanner. There's a complication. Elias felt something cold settle in his chest. After everything, the descent, the creatures, the Guardian's philosophical examination, they were going to lose her to a technicality. Define complication. Ross called up a molecular diagram that looked like a three-dimensional puzzle designed by aliens with a sadistic sense of humor. The xantharine will neutralize the parasitic organism, but the process requires a neural buffer to prevent synaptic shock. Essentially, her nervous system needs something to anchor to while it rebuilds itself. So we provide an anchor. It's not that simple. Ross highlighted sections of the diagram with increasing concern. The anchor has to be a compatible nervous system. Kalari neural architecture is similar enough to human that it could work, but the process creates a temporary neural link between subject and anchor. Shared memories, emotions, potentially permanent psychological connection. You'd be experiencing her thoughts, her feelings, her entire personal history, and she'd be experiencing yours. Elias looked at Ari, whose pale markings were now flickering erratically as her nervous system fought a losing battle against alien invasion. In her delirium, she was speaking in fragmented sentences that jumped between languages, between memories, between the person she'd been and the person she was afraid of becoming. What are the risks to the anchor? Ross was quiet for a moment. Neural feedback could cause permanent personality changes. Shared trauma might manifest as lasting psychological damage. And there's a small chance, maybe 5%, that the link becomes permanent. You'd be psychically connected for life. And if we don't do this, she dies in agony while her consciousness tears itself apart. The choice wasn't really a choice at all. Do it. Ross studied his friend's face, looking for any sign of doubt or hesitation. Finding none, he nodded grimly. I'll need to synthesize the treatment first. That'll take maybe 20 minutes. Use that time to prepare yourself, because once we start this process, there's no going back. Elias sat beside Ori's bed while Ross worked with the focused intensity of someone who'd learned that precision was often the difference between life and death. Her breathing was shallow and rapid, and occasionally she would speak, sometimes in Standard, sometimes in Kalari, sometimes in languages he didn't recognize. "The stars are falling," she whispered, her eyes tracking something that existed only in her fragmenting mind. "Father, the stars are falling, and I can't catch them." "Hey," Elias took her hand, surprised by how cold her skin felt. "The stars are fine. You're going to be fine." Her eyes focused on him for a moment, lucid and desperate. "Elias, you came back. I promised I would." "The hive. Was it terrible?" He thought about the Guardian, about the moment when violence had given way to understanding. "No, it was educational." She almost smiled at that. Always the diplomat. Even when facing death, you find a way to make it sound like a learning experience. Before he could respond, she slipped back into delirium, her grip tightening on his hand, as if she could anchor herself to consciousness through pure will. "Treatment's ready," Ross announced, holding up a hypodermic that contained enough synthesized xantharine to either save her life or kill them both. "Captain, last chance to reconsider." Elias looked at the woman who'd dismissed his warnings, who'd walked into danger with the absolute confidence of someone who'd never encountered a problem her intellect couldn't solve. The woman who carried the weight of peace between species on shoulders and that suddenly seemed too small for the burden. "Do it." Ross administered the injection with the smooth precision of someone who'd performed similar procedures under battlefield conditions. For a moment, nothing happened. Then Ori's neural monitors began showing patterns that resembled controlled chaos, her nervous system rebuilding itself in real time, while the xantharine neutralized the alien contamination. "Neural link establishing," Ross announced. "Captain, you're going to feel—" The connection hit Elias like a fusion bomb detonating inside his skull. Suddenly, he was 12 years old, standing in a diplomatic reception hall on Kalari Prime, watching his father negotiate with the species that looked at Kalari like curious specimens rather than people. The weight of expectation pressed down like atmospheric pressure on a deep-sea dive. "Emotion is a weakness, Ori." Ambassador Vela's voice carried the authority of someone who'd learned to survive by becoming ice. "Show them nothing. Give them nothing. Trust them with nothing." But even at 12, Ori knew her father was wrong. She could see the fear in his eyes when he looked at humans, the way his hands trembled, slightly when he thought no one was watching. His coldness wasn't strength. It was terror crystallized into a survival strategy. The scene shifted. Elias was experiencing Ori's first diplomatic mission, the crushing pressure of representing an entire species while barely 18 years old. The human delegates treated her like a curiosity, making jokes they thought she couldn't understand about alien ice queens and diplomatic deep freeze. She'd returned to her quarters that night and cried until her tear ducts ached, then spent the next morning practicing expressions of perfect composure in the mirror. Then Ori was in his memories, experiencing the Sakharis War from inside his guilt and trauma. She felt the weight of command, the impossible choices between bad options and worse ones. The moment when Sergeant Martinez looked at him with absolute trust right before the constructs tore him apart. But she also felt something else, the way Elias had carried that guilt, like a sacred burden, never trying to excuse it or explain it away. The way he'd used that pain to become someone who protected others, even when protection meant walking into alien hives alone. Back and forth, the memories flowed. Ori's desperate attempts to earn her father's approval by becoming the perfect diplomat. Elias's struggles with command responsibility and the weight of soldiers' lives. Her loneliness in diplomatic corps, where she was respected but never truly accepted. His isolation after Sakharis, carrying a survivor's guilt like a stone in his chest. And gradually understanding. Neither of them was what they appeared to be. Ori's ice-cold competence was armor against a universe that had taught her to expect betrayal. Elias's gruff protectiveness was his way of ensuring no one else died on his watch. They were both people who'd learned to carry impossible weights alone. The neural link dissolved as gradually as it had formed, leaving them staring at each other, with the complicated intimacy of people who'd shared secrets they had never spoken aloud. "Well," Ori said quietly, her voice steady for the first time in hours. "That was illuminating." Elias felt like someone had rearranged his internal landscape while he wasn't looking. He knew things about her now that she'd never told anyone: the loneliness, the pressure, the desperate need to prove herself worthy of her father's legacy. And she knew about Cyrus, about the way guilt had shaped him into someone who couldn't walk away from people in danger. Neural integration successful. Ross announced, checking readings that finally showed stable patterns. The parasitic organism has been neutralized, and cognitive function appears to be returning to normal parameters. How do you feel, Hugh? Elias asked. Ori considered the question seriously. Like someone rearranged my furniture while I was sleeping. Everything's familiar, but positioned differently. She paused. And I understand now why you tried to stop me from leaving the ship. I understand why you had to prove you could handle it yourself. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, processing the weight of shared experience. The neural link had dissolved, but its effects lingered, not permanent connection, but permanent understanding. The summit, Ori said, suddenly trying to sit up. How much time did we lose? The summit can wait, Elias said firmly. You nearly died. The peace process can survive a few days' delay. She looked at him with something that might have been surprise. 3 years ago, a human captain told me that schedules mattered more than people, that diplomatic efficiency was worth any personal cost. 3 years ago, a human captain was an idiot. This time her smile was genuine, warm, and unguarded in a way that transformed her entire face. Captain Ward, I believe that may be the first time anyone has ever prioritized my welfare over political expediency. Then you've been working with the wrong people. Outside the medical bay, Draveris wind howled across the Badlands, carrying the scent of alien storms and distant hives. But inside the Meridian, two people who'd started as strangers were discovering that real understanding was rarer and more valuable than diplomatic treaties. The rescue was complete. The reckoning had just begun. 3 days later, Ori Vela sat in the Meridian's observation lounge, watching Draveris's twin sons paint the Badlands in shades of copper and gold. Her neural patterns had stabilized completely, but the experience of nearly losing herself to alien contamination had left marks that went deeper than medical scans could detect. How are you feeling? Elias asked, settling into the chair beside her with 2 cups of coffee, one human-style, one adapted for Kalari physiology. Different, she said honestly, accepting the cup with a small smile. Not worse, just recalibrated. Like someone adjusted my internal compass and now true north points somewhere unexpected. Through the viewport, the crash site where they'd begun this journey was visible as a dark scar against the rust-colored landscape. Rescue ships had arrived that morning, bringing repair crews and the inevitable flood of official inquiries about what had happened to the diplomatic transport. The rescue coordinator wants to debrief us in an hour, Elias said. Standard protocol for emergency landings in restricted space. Ori nodded absently, her attention caught by something in the distance, movement near the hive entrance, where Elias had risked everything to save her life. The creatures down there, they're not just mindless predators, are they? No, there's intelligence there. Maybe not the kind we're equipped to understand, but definitely intelligence. He paused. The Guardian asked me why I was willing to die for someone I barely knew. What did you tell it? The truth, that you were important to the peace process. He studied her profile, noting the way her pale markings had settled into new patterns since the neural link. But it corrected me, said you were important to me personally. Ori turned to meet his gaze, those ice-blue eyes now holding warmth that had been absent when they'd first met. Were you surprised by that assessment? Yes and no. Oh, Elias sipped his coffee, considering his words carefully. I spent 7 years telling myself that what happened on Sahris was about tactical failures and command decisions. But it wasn't. It was about people, good people who trusted me to bring them home. And you've been carrying that guilt like armor ever since. Armor, penance, reminder, maybe all three. He set down his cup, studying the steam that rose from its surface. After Cyrus, I promised myself I wouldn't let anyone else die on my watch. Even stubborn diplomats' daughters who ignore perfectly reasonable safety warnings. Ori laughed, the sound lighter than anything he had heard from her before the neural link. Especially stubborn diplomats' daughters, apparently. Duras emerged from the medical bay, scanner in hand, and an expression of professional curiosity on his weathered features. Sorry to interrupt, but I wanted to discuss the neural link results. Both of them turned toward him with expressions that carried a hint of apprehension. The shared experience had been intense enough to fundamentally change how they saw each other. The prospect of permanent effects was both fascinating and terrifying. The good news is that cognitive function has returned to normal baseline for both of you. Ross began settling into a chair across from them. The parasitic organism has been completely neutralized, and there's no sign of lasting neural damage. And the bad news, Elias asked. It's not exactly bad news or, like, interesting news. Ross called up a neural scan on his portable display. The link left traces, not a permanent connection, but permanent changes in how your neural patterns respond to each other. You'll always be able to sense each other's emotional states to some degree. Ori blinked in surprise. Sense how empathic resonance. If one of you is in significant distress, the other will feel it. If one of you is in danger, the other will know. Ross shrugged. Think of it as a biological early warning system. Elias and Ori exchanged a look that carried the weight of shared experience and newfound understanding. The prospect of permanent connection should have been unsettling, but somehow it felt right, like a natural evolution of what they'd already discovered about each other. There's something else, Ori said quietly. I've been thinking about the summit, about my role in the peace process. The Dravari's delegation is probably wondering where their mediator disappeared to, Elias observed. Actually, they're not. Ori's smile held a hint of diplomatic satisfaction. I received a communiqué this morning. Both sides have agreed to postpone the summit indefinitely while they reassess their negotiating positions. Ross raised an eyebrow. Translation. Translation. They realized they were using me as a convenient excuse to avoid making real decisions about peace. Without their designated mediator, they actually have to talk to each other directly. Elias studied her face, noting the way her expression had shifted from diplomatic composure to something more genuine. You're not going back to the summit, are you? No, I'm not going back to the summit. I'm not going back to the diplomatic corps. And I'm definitely not going back to pretending that cold efficiency is a substitute for actually understanding the people you're trying to help. She stood and walked to the viewport, her reflection ghosting across the alien landscape beyond. Captain, I'd like to formally request political asylum. The words hung in the air between them like a detonated bomb. Elias felt his heart skip a beat as the implications settled in his mind. Asylum from what? From a life spent mediating conflicts I never really understood. From representing a people I was taught to see as superior to everyone else. From being the perfect diplomat's daughters instead of Elma. She turned back to face him. Instead of being someone who actually gives a damn about the people caught between political abstractions. Ross cleared his throat diplomatically. I should probably point out that requesting asylum is a complicated legal process with significant implications for interspecies relations. Dr. Ross, with respect, interspecies relations have been managed by people like my father for 30 years. Look how well that's worked out. Ori's voice carried the quiet conviction of someone who'd made a fundamental decision about the direction of their life. Maybe it's time for a different approach. What would you do? Elias asked. If asylum were granted, learn, study human settlements, understand how your species builds communities instead of just governing them. See how you handle conflict resolution at the individual level rather than the political level. She paused. And maybe help build something better than the Cold War we've been calling peace. Elias stood and joined her at the viewport, watching as one of the rescue ships prepared for departure. It won't be easy. There'll be political complications, cultural barriers, people on both sides who see you as a traitor. I know. Her smile was soft but determined. But after experiencing your memories, your feelings about command and responsibility and loss, I understand something I never understood before, which is that the hard choices are the ones worth making. That sometimes you have to risk everything you are to become something better. She looked at him with eyes that held depths he was still discovering. A very wise human once told me that some mistakes are worth dying to fix. That human was talking about his own mistakes. Maybe he was talking about a mistake that started 30 years ago at Kepler Station when fear and miscommunication turned potential allies into enemies. Outside, Dravaris wind carried the scent of alien storms and distant possibilities. Inside the Meridian, two people who'd started as strangers were planning a future that neither of their species had imagined possible. The asylum request will have to go through official channels, Elias said. Could take months to process. Then it's fortunate that my current transportation arrangements are somewhat flexible. Ori's eyes sparkled with something that might have been mischief. Captain, would you be willing to extend our professional relationship until the paperwork clears? I think that could be arranged. Good, because I have a feeling this partnership is going to change both of our lives in ways we haven't even imagined yet. 3 hours later, as the Meridian lifted off from Draveris and angled toward human space, Ori stood in the observation lounge watching the alien world fall away beneath them. The hive entrance was visible for a moment, a dark circle in the landscape that held memories of terror and revelation. Any regrets? Elias asked, joining her at the viewport. She considered the question seriously, then smiled with the warmth of someone who'd found their true north after years of navigating by other people's compasses. Maybe next time I'll listen to your warnings before the universe slaps me in the face. Elias laughed, the sound carrying relief and affection and the promise of futures neither of them had planned, but both were eager to explore. I'll try to make them sound less like lectures. Don't you dare. I've spent my entire life surrounded by people who told me what I wanted to hear. Having someone who tells me what I need to hear. She leaned against his shoulder with the casual intimacy of someone who'd shared memories and souls and wasn't afraid of either. That's rarer than Xantharine and considerably more valuable. Outside the viewport, stars wheeled in their eternal dance, indifferent to the small human dramas playing out in the ships that dared to cross the void between worlds. But sometimes those small dramas carried the seeds of larger changes, the kind that could transform species, reshape alliances, and prove that the universe's most powerful force wasn't gravity or nuclear fusion. It was the stubborn human insistence that some things were worth risking everything to save. Even stubborn diplomats' daughters who ignored perfectly reasonable warnings. Especially them. In the depths of Draveris, the Hive Guardian felt the ship's departure through senses that transcended ordinary perception. The human had kept his word, he'd taken only what was needed and left the sacred crystals intact. More importantly, he'd proven that some species could choose understanding over conquest. Perhaps there was hope for the smaller folk, after all. The Guardian settled back into its meditative state, patient as stone, waiting for the next test of character that the universe would inevitably provide. Sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is ignore a warning. But Ari learned that listening doesn't make you weak, and Elias proved that humanity's greatest strength isn't our weapons. It's our refusal to let good people die alone. If stories like this remind you why being human matters, hit that subscribe button for more tales where we're either the craziest species in the galaxy or the only one still worth saving.